Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Livermore. The episode today is sponsored by the Program on Law, Communities, and the Environment at the University of Virginia School of Law. With me today is Alex Wang, Professor of Law at UCLA and co-director of the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Alex is an expert on the law and politics of Chinese environmental governance, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, Alex. Thanks for joining me.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So prior to joining UCLA, you worked in China for a number of years for the environmental group NRDC. In fact, you even helped to start up and establish the Beijing office in 2006. And a lot has changed since 2006 in the world, in ourselves. Certainly the relationship between China and the U.S. are very different. The landscape of climate policy is very different. A lot has changed politically, economically, and technologically. So maybe to just get us started, we could kind of go back in time a little bit. And, what drew you to China at that time? And what was the vibe on environmental issues, kind of both within the Chinese environmental NGO community, such as it was at the time, vis-a-vis the U.S. and China, just thinking back to that time, what was the sense that you had of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thanks again for having me here, and really honored to be part of this podcast. So, the way I think about China, I went to China and was working for NRDC from 2005 to 2011, but my kind of work engagement with China goes back 30 years from right when I got out of college in the early 90s. I first had spent a year in China teaching English at a university in Wuhan in 1994, which now is very well known because of COVID, but back then was not known to really anybody. And so the changes in China from that time, over that 3 decades span, really informed the way I think about China, because the transformation is really generational. Or we're not going to see such a rapid transformation in a place, I think, for a long time. And so when I first started engaging with China, it had really just opened to the world, a little more than a decade before, after the Cultural Revolution, extraordinarily poor still. And China was at the beginning of kind of starting to focus on the economy as its way to modernize and to re-engage with the world. From my understanding, Walmart, for example, started sourcing out of China in the early 90s, kind of post Tiananmen Square. So flash forward, a little more than a decade when I started working with NRDC, that was a really interesting time in that, first of all, the kind of leadership was the Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao era, the predecessors to Xi Jinping. And China had not that long ago just joined the WTO. So if you look at all the economic statistics, that really, hypercharged China's economic growth and contributed to all of the environmental problems that are associated with that, due to the rapid growth of energy use, the rapid build out of coal-fired power plants, and just all the pollution associated with manufacturing and heavy industry, and those sorts of things. And so when I first started working on environmental issues, I was just at that point just 4 or 5 years out of law school, and the opportunity I had, which I don't think I fully understood at the time where it was coming from, but what I now realize is, it was a period in China where they'd made a lot of commitments as part of their entry into the WTO. Some of you may remember that in the 90s, in the decade post Tiananmen, there was a lot of back and forth and kind of political battles and debates in the U.S. about whether to support China entering the WTO, to what extent to tie that to human rights commitments and these sorts of things. And when China joined the WTO in 2001, there were a lot of commitments that China made, in our world of law, a lot of them are associated with the types of things you think about that are just accepted parts of administrative law, kind of transparency, the right to participate, the right to have judicial recourse for conflicts, these sorts of things. And so when I first joined NRDC, we had gotten a grant to help Chinese actors figure out how to implement these commitments. So they'd had some laws, there was an administrative licensing law, which was all about transparency and the, kind of notice and comment types of things. And so we were running a lot of programs that were really just about the bread and butter things that environmental groups and citizens do in the United States, just learning about some hearing that's coming up, going and finding out what's going on, submitting comments. Then, if there's conflicts down the road, bringing public interest lawsuits. So I had a chance to work with some of just really impressive people in China, law professors and lawyers who were bringing the first public interest lawsuits, environmentalists who were really pushing hard on transparency, and government officials, frankly. Lots of people in the government were interested in these things for a variety of reasons, for the sort of kind of, I guess, participatory values reasons, but also for practical reasons of governance and trying to figure out what was going on in the hinterlands and those sorts of things. And so I had a really interesting run during that time, and it was a very open time in terms of a lot of interest in the way Americans did things, Westerners did things on environmental regulation, and quite frankly, very, extraordinarily serious environmental degradation. Right, that was in the press quite a lot, and really shaped the way people thought about China. And so flash forward a few years when I entered academia in 2011. A lot of what I was thinking about was trying to unpack and unwind what I had experienced during a real whirlwind of a few years, which now in retrospect wasn't that many years, but really felt like an eternity, just 6 years on the ground, but, saw enough to pack, several decades of life experience, I think. And just really trying to understand what I saw and to understand the transformations. And what I saw, part of what I saw, which might be interesting to our listeners, is I in a sense saw the flip side of what was going on in America, right? Like if you think of part of the rise of Trump and the polarization as related to the decline of manufacturing in the United States, which it has to do with automation and these things, but in part is due to the shift of business to China. I sort of saw the boom on the China side. I spent a lot of time visiting, power plants and, textile plants and all sorts of factories, shirt plants, and just to see what was going on. And you saw the boom and the energy on that side. So my academic work has been all about kind of thinking about the way China runs things, how it's different than what I had expected and what I was advocating for during that time. And also thinking more broadly about how that makes us think about the way China runs things. I was listening to your very good podcast with Jed Purdy on kind of the state of democracy, and there's a lot of connections with what you guys were talking about that podcast. You guys were talking about this sense in the 90s of the end of history, and the fact that we'd kind of arrived at the final end state. And China is one of the big reasons why that is destabilized, for a variety of reasons. And we can talk more about that. But, certainly the party, the Communist Party in China is trying to really make the case that its way of doing things, authoritarian, top-down, however you want to describe it, is at least as legitimate as democracy, and that's really part of the kind of global political debates. So happy to take this conversation in any direction. There's lots of interesting things to talk about here.
Yeah, there sure are. Just kind of maybe sticking with this last point that you raised, which is super interesting, again, maybe dialing or casting yourself back to the perspective that you had when during this period of time, formative period of time when you were there, formative for you and formative for the whole world, really.
For sure, yeah.
Is so yeah, there was this notion that some folks had, this end of history stuff, that after China's entry into the WTO and the big economic boom and the growth of a kind of at least somewhat capitalist or market-based economy, or the relaxation of state control over the economy at the very least, that was going to lead, this kind of classic thing, that was going to lead to the growth of liberal democracy through some as yet to be fully specified process, but that was like a natural thing that would unfold. Did you buy into that? Was that something that you thought seemed realistic at the time, and then now that we look back, maybe wasn't, or was it something that you were always kind of skeptical of? And what about folks in China at the time? Was on the ground, was that a feeling that was realistic, or was that a thing amongst folks in the U.S. and Europe?
Yeah, so that's a really complicated question. I think it totally depends on where you stood at the time. For me, I thought of myself as a public interest advocate. So it was a narrower brief, right? I was working for an environmental group. We had pretty specific environmental aims that obviously were mixed in with sort of democratic kinds of approaches to things, right? So the transparency and the public participation all are can be grouped under a category of democratic. But we weren't really thinking about kind of regime change or democratization or those types of things. But certainly if you'd run into people from like a USAID or more government-oriented people, they probably did have those things in mind, and that was a pretty widespread notion. Not in the sense that people were sure it was going to happen, but the basic premise was, of course, that once you get richer, once you sort of see the opportunities brought by some marketization and openness, that citizens would sort of demand greater political liberalization, right? And we now understand a lot more about the way China has run things, and there's been a lot more marketization, but of course, while the party has maintained pretty tight political control, and that of course doesn't mean that people's lives, that it's sort of a totalitarian state, right? This we can talk more about also, but I think if you've spent time in China, or if you grew up in China, what you experience, and especially certainly my students, they've experienced decades during their entire life of basically rapid improvements on an annual basis in their economic well-being and the choices that offers, right? So I've been like, I have Amartya Sen's Development as Freedom here in my office, and I've been looking at that because clearly there are certain civil freedoms you do not have and political freedoms you don't have in China, but the economic growth allowed very basic transformations in the ability of people to control their own lives in terms of just choosing what you wanted to do for a living, going on vacation, traveling abroad, sending kids to school in the United States or in Europe, and in all of the types of things that come with economic development. And so that part is such a important part of the Chinese story that I think maybe people outside don't really understand, because in the United States sometimes it's this feeling of like, given the kind of human rights stories and things like that we see, there's a sense that how could Chinese people really like living in that system, right? And I think you have to understand that the political things are things that I think need to be changed, and I think that particularly the human rights violations, but if you look at the numbers of people that affects, it's a smaller percentage of people, and then you have the mass majority of people often experiencing the economic growth and these sorts of things.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because in a way, I don't know if it's a cultural bias or what exactly, but this emphasis that it's very important as a matter of just just it's important to people in some ways that they be able to exercise the vote, or that the press works in certain ways or whatever. But in a way, I don't know, and maybe this is to your point, is there's something that's kind of elite oriented about that. It's like amongst elites, in the U.S., let's say, and in Europe, those kinds of issues are very important, right? That if journalists are being cracked down on, that's a big deal. In part because if you're an elite, you might know some journalists, right? Or it's important to you that your news sources are reliable and credible. Like and that's a luxury in some ways. Like that's after you're fed and your kids are fed and your education's taken care of and you've got a decent, your transportation, you can get around and, these other things. And so I wonder if that, part of, just this is maybe just reiterating what you were saying, but, freedom was increasing along all these dimensions. And it just turns out that, people, they were getting what was most important to them in some sense. And so there wasn't this big clamoring for political liberties or that we would associate with a liberal democracy anyway, in part because, they were becoming more autonomous over time and had greater scope of their lives in the ways that kind of mattered most to them.
Right, and so certainly they don't have the right to select their leaders in the way the thing we associate mainly with democracy, right? But so there's a number of ways in which I think you can account for the resilience of the party and a sense of growing freedom. Some of it is about what I was referring to earlier, which is just the economic freedom to control your own life apart from the state. But there's also interesting developments if you want to get more legal about it. This was the area I focused on, both at NREC and in my academic work, which is the ways the state was responsive or not to citizen demands, right? So some of it was actually in the form of administrative law types of reforms, so hearings, transparency. And so there, for example, in the environmental space, that was one of the main issues I focused on during my NRDC period. And there's been massive expansions in the amount of pollution data disclosed and transparency in a variety of ways. But in ways that are less familiar to Americans, there were also all sorts of other ways in which the bureaucracy was able to gather information from society and to choose to respond or not, right? And so in some sense, you just saw it with the COVID protests, right?
Yep.
So if you think of protests, often the media discussion turns to, will the regime be overthrown or not, right? Right. Which is a massive, 0 to 100 kind of discussion. But short of the overthrow, what's going on with protests, right? What we saw, during my time, and a lot of people have written about this, is smaller scale protests as just a regularized form of engagement between society and the state, and the way that the center also can monitor local governments, right? Like Beijing.
Yep.
If they see an area that there's a lot of protests, that's a sure sign that there's something going on in which the local officials are not managing things right. And so, local officials learn different techniques to manage and not get the signal sent up to Beijing that they're not handling their jurisdiction, right? Sometimes it's crackdown, right? So you've heard all sorts of crazy stories. Sometimes the local officials send kind of thugs to Beijing to hang around the complaints office and to listen for people with the local dialect so they can snatch them up and put them in black jails and ship them back home, right? So they prevent the data from reaching Beijing. But sometimes it does lead to just concessions, right? Yep. And there's a great documentary called The Chinese Mayor, which I think is available on Amazon Prime, which is about a kind of northern mayor. And the way he manages, it was a period where he was massively tearing down large parts of the city, which naturally led to lots of conflicts, people not wanting to be forcibly removed, and showing how he dealt with it. So some of it was harsh and crackdowns. A lot of it was informal kind of engagement with people. And I would say, you describe it as the politician's sense of who did he have to give concessions to.
Hmm.
People who
Hmm.
were, squeaky enough wheels would get some sort of concessions. Others might not get concessions. And there's this very kind of fluid, informal aspect, which is, there's probably core parallels you could think of in our political system, but
Hmm.
this looks quite different, right? The idea that a mayor would have in the United States, the LA mayor would have 100 people swarm him as he leaves his office in the morning, and then he can sort of divvy up apartments to a few of them that just on his own personal whims
Right.
would not play well in the United States, right? But this was
Right.
kind of part of the formula, and it's a form of accountability. It's not really fair, it's not
Right.
procedurally fair and those types of things, but it was one way that they managed things, and it's when you get under that hood to see that there was this accountability in conjunction with kind of hard control, right? So you're seeing it with the COVID protests now. Like some of the news stories coming out was, you saw the concession of rollback of COVID crackdowns, but then now there are the news stories of those people who were visible leaders, too visible on the Chinese version of Twitter or whatever, are now facing some repercussions. They're getting sought out by authorities, and so it's that push and pull to kind of where the party is trying to keep things within a band, I suppose, would be a somewhat neutral way of putting it. And so I think that part of it is really fascinating. And so you think of like protest statistics, letters and visits is kind of a kind of quasi legal kind of complaints process, or even like litigation numbers. How much are you seeing certain types of lawsuits are all being sort of fed into the system and the bureau. And in the Chinese system, you might think of courts as more as part of the bureaucracy rather than as a kind of
Right.
separate from the government. The judges are also being evaluated in, how often are they being overturned? How often does their decision lead to, unrest or complaints or these types of things? And so it leads to judges being in complicated situations where they rely on the law, among other things, to make their decisions, right? There are also political targets and things like that, and kind of political, just kind of the messaging that they're hearing from on high that informs the way they have to grapple with different types of disputes that arise.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. I think it's important, reality, on the ground reality that a lot of folks miss in the U.S. when they observe, just kind of casually thinking about China or observe China, think about China, is this really complex, what I think would be fair to call political system, dynamic, right? There's a lot of politics that happen. It just isn't electoral politics in the way that, which isn't to say that it's the best, but just to note that it is a reality, right? And just with the COVID protests, very interesting, as you mentioned, that just occurred to me, I've never seen in the United States a situation where large-scale protests, even big ones that we've had in recent years, including things like the BLM movement or BLM and Me Too and the like, led to such an immediate and concrete policy change as what happened. That just doesn't happen here.
Right.
Like it's way too. It's just too. I don't know why exactly. I think we could probably talk about that, but that's just not how our system works, which is very interesting because in a sense, it's the Chinese government was showing itself to be actually quite responsive to at least some particular kind of demands made in some particular kind of ways.
Right. But, it also partly reflects how extreme the Chinese policy had been, right? And so, it had gotten to a point where, people were really upset. This year, for example, our LLM students who came in from China, during COVID, for I guess 2 years, we didn't really have many students from China, but they came back this year, and quite a few of them are from Shanghai. And so they were essentially imprisoned for the early part of 2022, right? There was a lot of news about, people being locked up, not allowed to
Yeah.
exit, and then they had to rely on food, rationed food and rationed deliveries of food, and which often were pretty sparse. And so they had a pretty negative view, and the sort of complaints about governance were much higher than I'd ever seen from Chinese students, who are normally pretty judicious, I guess, about being vocal about criticisms. Especially to people that they've only just met, and so people were pretty, So I didn't by any means predict the protests, but when they came, it was consistent with a turn in attitude I'd heard just a few months earlier from my students who had just kind of emerged from Shanghai. And so, but your observation's interesting, and this is the interesting debate about the Chinese authoritarian system, right? Like often when we talk about it in the West, to the extent that it's spoken of in a positive way, it's often as a foil to the difficulty of getting things done in our system, right? So, particularly often you hear it. I used to receive a lot of visitors when I was in Beijing, and often it's in particular in response to how quickly China was building infrastructure, right? And so it would often be like, oh, I wish we could do that. I wish we could get things done like they can in China. And that's both an overstatement of what is possible in China, but when there's there's not a lot of dispute about the direction, or it's a very important issue, things can move particularly quickly. Lots of other issues, it's much more fragmented, and so there's also kind of stagnation, and things get blocked up in a way that would be familiar to us in our system. But of course, I mean, as you guys discussed on the podcast with Jed, a lot of this is by design, right? In the U.S. system to not allow kind of rapid change, and so rapid change is certainly possible in China, for better or for worse, right? It can change in pretty dark directions too. If you think of like Cultural Revolution times and the Great Leap Forward and the famine during that in the early decades of the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, and this notion of this envy of the the rapidity with which China can act. That always struck me as there's some element of truth. It always struck me as misunderstanding China to a certain extent, but also like we've had that at different times in U.S. history. And Robert Moses is a very interesting figure in the history of New York, right? Like, stuff got built, but like a lot of it we now regret, and we certainly regret like how it was done, and leveling African American neighborhoods and without any process, and then all this this car infrastructure that he locked in place. So it always just strikes me as like, so Ezra Klein has been on a hobby horse about this.
I just listened to the Yuan Yuan Ang one, which was very good, and hits on some of the things we're talking about now. Yep. It's interesting that you bring up the Robert Moses piece, because I'm really interested in like the Robert Caro exploration of American power, and I've been playing with this idea of Yuan Yuan Ang actually uses this idea of China as a mirror image of the United States. I've been thinking about that idea, but in a different sense. And in my China classes, I often show the famous "You Can't Handle the Truth" scene from A Few Good Men. Right. So it turns out this is what makes me feel old, because most of my students have not seen that movie.
Probably
right?
don't know about
early
it.
90s, I guess. But for me, it's like such a seminal legal movie, right? And now when you look at it in retrospect, it's such a full-throated movie about the American way, right? The American rule of law. And, that scene in particular, it's, the law coming in, clamping down on this powerful military figure, right? And his speech is all about, you ungrateful jerk, you don't appreciate what I do for your security, and, you can't tolerate the way I get things done. And to me, now that I've been studying China, that scene really plays differently to me, in the sense that, like in the Moses story, which is really all about how we can look back and really say, like, kind of criticize Moses.
Mm-hmm.
But in some sense, I think if Americans were to be more honest about ourselves, right, like you have to think about, the Few Good Men scene and the Robert Moses story as kind of really the story of the uneven development of America, right? That we appreciate the good things that it's brought, but oftentimes it was done in a way, maybe, at the time, certainly not even tacitly, but explicit, sort of accepted as a way of doing things. But, in some ways, a kind of tacit, the system will criticize that, but it's always been a part of the way things get done. China's story is, in a sense, the reverse of that, in that they celebrate, in a sense, that their party line is the Jack Nicholson speech.
Right, it's the Jack Nicholson line, right.
And then what is the hidden part is actually the Tom Cruise part, in the sense that they've introduced a lot of kind of stuff on the edges. It's sort of like the dominant story is the Jack Nicholson story, and it's tempered by the Tom Cruise stuff. In my view, kind of insufficiently.
Right.
Whereas in some ways, the American story is really, the story we tell about ourselves is the Tom Cruise story, but the dark secret is the Jack Nicholson stuff, which, there's lots of different ways you can frame that. But, if you're more of a critic from the critical side, you'd say, you'd probably say, that's just the American way, and we don't like to talk about that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And, I think that if I'm just kind of see, because I feel like there's a cool insight there. And of course, I like talking about movies from the 1990s. So I'm trying to get squeeze more out of this. But in a way, there's like something about the Tom Cruise line, the rule of law, holding power to account. We do things by the book thing. I wonder, like, if a more like a critical theorist would say, it's actually like that story in a way allows for the raw exercise of power, right? That you need the Tom Cruise in order for the Jack Nicholsons of the world to be able to do their thing. And it's completely dependent on it, and it tacitly allows it, except for occasionally making a big deal out of, holding someone to account. And so that's interesting. And I wonder,
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder if there's, like, again, trying to keep this with the inverse story with China, like, does the fact that they make a big deal out of kind of, by any means necessary, doing the things that, we want collectively to do, achieve prosperity or social, cohesion or whatever, somehow empower the small moves of rule of law and regularization and fairness, procedural fairness or whatever that kind of happen in the shadows in some sense.
Yeah, so I mean that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think you could answer that a couple of different ways. I mean, one development that doesn't fully map onto my kind of Jack Nicholson analogy is that there's a way in which the party is trying to essentially redefine language in ways that we may or may not agree with. So one of the most obvious ways is that a lot of the party rhetoric now just says we are a democracy. We're just a different type of democracy.
Right.
And what they really mean by that is that the party thinks about what the people want. Right. So there's always sorts of ways we could get into a long debate about how to critique that. Right. But it's an interesting question, right? Because certainly in some respect, party policy has dovetailed with what people want in some respects. But certainly lots of other things that people want are completely excluded from that. But then how do you compare that to a democracy in which, of course, you don't always get everything that you want? And how do you define what the people want anyway, given the diversity and such? So there's a way in which words are just being redefined. The other thing I think that you're getting at is, does it allow political space for people who are promoting more liberal kinds of policies? And there's been some work in political science about a term Kevin O'Brien at Berkeley coined, which is rightful resistance, which is this idea that, people could take advantage of commitments at the top to, the risk for the center of not listening to the demands is that for these things like for rule of law or transparency is that the leaders look like hypocrites because they've been saying that they want these things, and so they have to give some concessions because there's that political pressure not to just look like you're saying one thing and just completely doing the other, and so that provides this kind of tenuous political space for people to push for things. And there are obviously limits to it because if you push too hard, then it becomes easier for the state to crack down on you. But if you can kind of keep it within bands, there is some space. But this kind of political game is constantly shifting. So that I would say that game was much more an active one during my period of time in China. So pre-Xi. So since Xi, and I haven't spent nearly as much time on the ground since in the last decade, but from everything I've heard and discussions is that space has just become much tighter and much narrower, right? Because of the direction of centralization and political tightening and these sorts of things. And so all the signals and all the actions have made it harder to play that game. And so the game will just continue to change, and we'll have to see where it heads, I think.
So so that's a huge transition, right? Since you were in China to today is Xi's rise and consolidation of power. That's massive, and I'm curious about the connection of that to there's maybe three things happening. There's political change, there's economic change. And then there's environmental change, all happening simultaneously. So as you mentioned, like when you were certainly there in the 90s and early aughts, or in the aughts, that there was all of this concern that spilled out globally, but was I'm sure a very big deal in China about air quality and pollution and just general pollution and so on. It's just starting to get figured out and addressed, And so I'm curious about the interaction of these things. Like, there's been progress on environmental issues in China in terms of like outcomes. I assume I should be, curious to hear your thoughts about that. Yeah. And then how does that interact with kind of economic changes and political changes that have happened in the past couple of decades?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, so that's a great question. And I think, so for people who aren't tracking this, the environmental story, in terms of like the political priority of environmental regulation or environmental protection, there's been a really big change in the last, say, 15 to 20 years. And so I think that change started when I was on the ground. In what the 2006 to 2010 period was China's 11th five-year plan. China uses these kind of Leninist five-year plans. And so that was a period where you started to see a shift towards greater prioritization of environment. And then that has continued over the last decade. And to the extent that now kind of this idea of what the Chinese call eco-civilization, which you could just conceive of as a sort of concept of environmental protection, has been put in the Constitution, and it's become a big political priority with a lot of bureaucratic targets attached to it and all sorts of policies associated with it. And the way that I understand that transition is, it's partly environmental, but it's also political and economic. So all three of those areas that you mentioned are all wrapped up in the environmental story. And this is a lot of my academic work is kind of thinking about the intersections there. And so, if it's the part that's most consistent with the story we tell about environmental regulation, and we just had Richard Lazarus at UCLA a couple days ago talking about his second edition of Making of Environmental Law. So I got to hear a refresher of our American environmental history, and just thinking about the kind of bottom-up story, right, that we're very familiar with. There was an aspect of that in the Chinese system in the terms of a lot of people were really unhappy with the air pollution, the water pollution, the soil pollution, and it was leading to all sorts of, hundreds, if not thousands, of protests a year all over the country. And from the position of Beijing or the subnational governments, this was a massive governance problem, stability problem, social stability problem, which is very prized as a political value within the Chinese system. And so they needed to get a handle on that, right? And so part of that was drove some of the action. And that relates to how it's a political story, right? It's about like maintaining enough satisfaction so that you don't lose legitimacy, you don't have an unmanageable level of protest. And then it also dovetailed with the economic story, which was that China, the leaders have been very clear that they want to transform the economy into something more like the developed world economies, right? Which is more services and less heavy industry and agriculture, right? They want to upgrade the economy in a sense. And so the environmental stuff could be wrapped together with that piece, right? So if you think of just more economic kind of policies, like trying to limit overcapacity in steel and cement, or trying to develop tech industries or tourism industries, those types of things are all could be in part pushed through environmental laws, right? So if you ban some of the worst, if you disfavor heavy industry, for example, which they've done in the wealthier provinces in particular, that can, it can drive out some of that business and kind of lay the groundwork for that. It kind of sits hand in hand with subsidies for AI or tech or advanced manufacturing and those sorts of things. And so that has not, that's been a difficult thing to push, and the transformation has been halting in many ways. But the overall trend is towards more services, less on heavy industry. And so the environmental story is in part about that, improving efficiency, certainly, of the industry you have, and also disfavoring, trying to essentially pushing kind of the transition which we had in Europe and the United States, which was export of the most polluting stuff, right? So the if you look at the California environmental story, the story you will hear is very much about regulation and the ingenuity of policy and government. But a big part of it was the shift of, lots of industries we don't have anymore in California, right? They just moved to China. Right. And now China is kind of doing the same thing. And a lot of this stuff is already, within China, there's an export from the coastal, eastern and southern coastal provinces inland. That was the initial stage of it, and it's still happening, sort of. And then there's also now export to the so-called, Belt and Road countries, or a lot of the global South countries, and it's already happening. And scholars have been working on kind of quantifying that and that sort of thing.
Yeah, really interesting. I think it's a very similar story to the U.S., where there's internal shifts in industry, and then ultimately, heavy industry, polluting industry, went elsewhere, went to Mexico, went to China, and I think that takes us into another kind of big important thing that has shifted in the last 20 years in thinking about governance in China, environmental governance, is just the relationship between the U.S. and China, and how China's global profile has just shifted, right? So there was in the 90s it was about bringing China into the kind of global world order, I guess, so to speak, with the WTO and the trading system and the like. And now China is pursuing a much more, I don't know if expansionist is the right term, but it has been quite clear that it wants to take up a leadership role on the global stage, and working with countries throughout the global South, and investment, and all of this is happening. So again, just thinking about the shifting, geopolitics, I guess we could say, in the relationship between China and the U.S. How much of this do you think was, kind of think again, casting yourself back to that earlier time? Was this kind of on the cards, or was this? It was, and that it's just a natural evolution of a relationship, or is this the result of kind of specific actors making specific decisions that kind of led us to the place that we're in now, where there's actually, we're maybe not at a nadir in the relationship, but it seems to be a lot worse, a lot more conflict ridden than it was in the, say in the 2000s.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think maybe some people predicted exactly where we are, but I certainly, when I think back to that time, I don't think I foresaw where we are today, right? Just how much China's global kind of strength has grown. Their economic power has grown by such leaps and bounds. But in retrospect, it's been interesting to me. Again, why I say like this kind of 3-decade engagement in China really informs my view of China is, I really remember well in the early 90s when I was in Wuhan, at the time, there were some foreign companies, there were some foreign, and, there were auto factories. There was a Budweiser plant in Wuhan. There was a guy who worked for Enron, if you remember Enron,
yeah.
who was kind of in Wuhan, who we'd see at this local expat bar. And, I remember the tone of foreigners towards China was really just, it was very much a kind of weird, the kind of global leaders, and this is a really backwards place. There was a kind of disrespect, right? And that's been really interesting just to see how that has gradually changed to recognizing China as a global player, and then to now this past decade, which is seeing China as a threat. Right. And we're doing this podcast on the morning that this news of the spy balloon over Montana is breaking all over the place, and Blinken has just canceled his trip to China, and so who knows where this will take us? But things are in a really difficult situation. But it's interesting, like, to connect this question to what we were just talking about earlier about what motivated China to kind of embrace kind of environmental policies. Right? Like, you only have to look at like the clean tech area to see part of the story of how this developed and to lead us to where we are, right? So I think, China, why did China, they passed a renewable energy law in 2006. Why did they get into this, right? It wasn't purely for environmental reasons, right? Like the green groups and the green people like us will focus on that, but there was very much, politics, energy security, not knowing that they had to import so much from outside, and also there was economic opportunities in what were industries in which there were not dominant global incumbents, right? And so they thought, well, this might be a good place to invest some money and to put industrial policy behind on wind, solar, batteries, these types of things, electric vehicles. And there's no guarantee of success on that, but it has led to a situation now in which China just absolutely dominates the supply chains of these different things. If you think solar PV, batteries, wind, electric vehicles. And, what was motivating at the time, in part, it was not, there's going to be lots of postmortems to talk about how strategic it was, but in part it's just going where there was less resistance, right? Why was China buying oil from like human rights violators? Often it was because the foreign companies weren't able or willing to go there, and so that was where they could get good oil supplies, right? So they go to Sudan or whatever, and so this was like they were looking for places where there wasn't just blinding competition from global multinationals, and they went to these. They invested a lot of money in these places where there just wasn't a dominant player, right? And so it's allowed them to really, in the short span of 10, 15 years, to really become globally dominant. And part of the tensions then arise out of that, right? Like, think about like solar, like trade conflicts related to solar. That's a really interesting tension point that I think we all need to understand better. Like, how do we grapple with the supply chain dominance of China in batteries and clean tech, right? Like, I'm all for the provisions, the Inflation Reduction Act provisions that seek to shift manufacturing, at minimum to diversify manufacturing, but to try to reshore to the United States. But I have no idea whether that will work, right? Like, I want to listen to the economists or business people as to whether that can actually work in the long run. Given China's cost advantage, their manufacturing advantages these days. But that is part of the source of tension. And politically, of course, given what, for example, what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, Europe sees the risks of relying on natural gas from a kind of geopolitical rival, right? Energy from, and so that's clearly in the mix in the U.S. China discussions, and how we resolve it. I think everyone's thinking about it now. I don't really have a good answer for that, but it makes it very interesting in terms of when you think about geopolitics and climate, right? Because among some of the environmental researchers who focus on China, who I respect a lot, are doing a lot of work showing the difficulty for our achievement of our climate goals that will be put in if we try to shut off China's supply chains. It'll just increase the cost of everything, right? At least in the near and medium term. And so how much does that slow deployment of the technologies we need, these sorts of things? That's all kind of troublesome dilemmas that we're going to have to grapple with. I think in the short term, we're going to have to continue if you think of cooperation with China as buying things from them, there's no way we can stop buying a lot of these key things from them, and it's going to take a little while to kind of get manufacturing up or diversify sourcing. But I think that's the direction where we're going to head. But probably in the near term, we're going to see there's going to be a lot of work for the lawyers and consulting firms on how to structure things so that they don't run afoul of laws. But in fact, probably there's still Chinese involvement, right? Like you got to imagine there's going to be a lot of that in the Beltway.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because it's so hard given how integrated our global economy is to then try to de-link it, especially on something as complex as in the energy space. Just one example of this that I just saw was a bit of analysis on the EU energy markets and where they're getting their natural gas and how like liquefied natural gas markets are being affected by delinking with Russia and so on. And I just saw this tidbit, which was Egypt has become a supplier, and part of and they've actually reduced their domestic usage of natural gas in order to sell for export, but they've increased their usage of like dirtier fuels, including like fuel oil, which is purchased from Russia. So like and I feel like so for me, I don't know if these days is a potential possibly contrarian perspective on this, but if one story that maybe we would have told 10 years ago is globalization is how we're going to get out of from under climate change. Like we need all hands on deck. We need to find the cheapest sources for all of our, our clean energy needs. We need to make this huge transition. And this huge transition is only going to be possible if we can all work together and maximize the, the productivity of the global economic system, which means, you build, one thing in China, you build another thing in India, you build another thing in Mexico, right? Just a kind of standard comparative advantage story about globalization. And then I think the old story anyway used to be, and that's a good thing for peace and prosperity because, China needs us, we need China. And so therefore, we don't go to war over Taiwan. And, and it's good that Taiwan makes all the microprocessors because then we don't go, no one wants to bomb them because it's like key to like how everything functions. Right. And it does seem like we're moving away from that. And energy and the environment is kind of a leading example where it's not, there's other things like the chip stuff and the kind of reshoring more generally of different kinds of technology. But the IRA as kind of a core example of industrial policy is all about this, right? Where the subsidies are limited for, to stuff that's manufactured in the U.S. and there's all these kinds of efforts to de-link in some sense the clean energy manufacturing process from the at least big chunks of the global economy. So Right. For me, this just strikes me as you say, like there's risks associated with that. One is it's going to be more costly. There's just no way around that. And which drives up the price of electricity, drives up the price of clean energy vis-a-vis fossil, which is bad. And then the other one is, this concern about delinking, has a little bit of a precursor to a trade war kind of vibe. And so I wonder if, as someone who follows this closely, does this give you worrying, kind of the shivers a little bit? It gives me the shivers a little bit.
Of course, yeah. No, that Egypt example is a great one, and I totally on board with your comments. I think the short answer is I don't totally know how I think about all this. I'm just sort of trying to absorb the complexities of this. It probably will require me to dive more into trade law than I ever wanted to, right? But for example, like forced labor in Xinjiang, right? So, part of there's partly just the human rights story, which I'm totally on board with trying to stop that from happening, right? There's the symbolic aspect of just politicians in the Beltway needing to talk tough about China and what is their willingness then to follow it up with actual implementation and all these types of things. And then there's the how do you then continue to achieve your climate goals in light of the economic consequences of that policy. I suppose right now it's just I think you have to deal with all of them, and you just try to create the best balance, because there was some debates, particularly among more lefty environmental groups, of some people suggesting like maybe we shouldn't be we shouldn't link these things to human rights so much because of the importance of the climate issue. And that kind of debate was happening in DC, and it feels wrong to me. Like if you've identified forced labor, you've got to deal with that. But you also have to avoid, make sure it's not like a cover for just American companies trying to gin up something to kind of shift business their way. So I don't know the answer to these things, but I think in my work I've just tried to sort of, for example, I and a couple of other people have had a piece out in Science recently that, roughly speaking, tries to turn down the temperature a little bit about national security and economic shock concerns, and just to try to identify where the real risks are, and tries to warn people not to inflate risks because of the potential damage to climate action that could lead to. But all the entire direction within the Beltway these days is so anti-China that it's natural for us in the academic sphere to worry about kind of a return of McCarthyism and all of the negative things that can bring. Right? There's now the Republicans have set up a China committee that we're waiting to see what they plan to do. But we're always on the alert for kind of overreach, but also there's obviously genuine policy concerns and risks that the politicians have to deal with.
Right. So, yes, this is all very complicated moment that we're in. So one of the, another recent paper that you put together on kind of the cooperation and the prospect of cooperation and competition for, the future prospects of climate change. One of the chunks of that, maybe we can kind of end with this conversation, is the this notion that the U.S. and China are going to be in competition with each other for the foreseeable future in many different domains. That in part, as we were kind of talking about, there are these alternative models of the world, maybe more similar to each other or more mirror imagey than either side might realize, but nevertheless alternatives models, and that maybe optimistically there could be competition between these two models on things that are like socially beneficial, like addressing climate change, like restructuring the economy in a more decarbonizing the economy. So I guess almost as a proxy battle, right? So it's like the Olympics or the moon race during the Cold War, but now we're going to race to decarbonize. I mean, that would really be wonderful. I guess the question is, what happens to that? It's a lot cheaper to send someone to the moon than it is to decarbonize the economy, right? So what happens, and this relates to the goals stuff, like where everyone says, okay, we're going to decarbonize by 2050, just give us 10 years and then we'll start, right? What happens when the rubber hits the road and it really starts to get expensive? Do you think that that this competitive kind of proxy battle over systems of governance is enough to fuel a really serious decarbonization, or are we going to look back and say we got to look start building a cooperative model after all, because ultimately we need a market, or we need something else to
Yeah.
fuel this thing.
Yeah. So that's a tough question, and I'm a terrible futurist, but I can think about, I guess, the what that piece that you're talking about, I was reacting to was, the media framing was often, especially when Biden came. I started writing that when Biden came in, and the media was all talking about, oh, now we can return to cooperation, everything's going to be okay, and if we don't get cooperation, then the world is going to collapse, like roughly speaking, right? That was the framing, at least, of the underlying premise of a lot of the writing. And so this was partly, I and a number of people have thought about the competition framing and the implications of that. And just to say, look, are we overplaying the role of certainly Beijing to DC cooperation, because there's so much else going on, and also the problems are really so much broader now, as we've been discussing. They're now trade and human rights, things that like John Kerry doesn't have power to really dictate, right? And and so in large part, that was the impetus for that. And you still see this kind of framing often in the media reporting. And, I don't blame journalists. They're writing on tight deadlines. They don't have the time to recreate create a new framework for each article. But I think that needs to be a corrective to the way that we discuss this. And we're also seeing, on the competition front, like, of course, competition can matter, right? Like, in the sense that if you think of China and the U.S. as having like a business to business kind of competition, that's the natural way we think of markets and business, right? And we believe that can lead to faster development of things. And, arguably the Inflation Reduction Act is in part, there's a China component of that, right? And I think Biden has said as much in speeches that, part of the story is trying to outcompete China. And would the IRA have gotten through without this China element? Maybe so. I have no idea. But the China politics and the sense that we need to outcompete China, which is dominating, and that the China dominance in these important industries will lead to their political power that will create security risk for us. That's in the backdrop of all of this stuff, in a way that, if it leads to more our political willingness to invest more money in these types of things, that seems like a good thing, right? And arguably we're seeing it at work now, right? That dynamic is contributing to movement in a way that more broadly speaking, does it somewhat start to shift our notion of what the role of government should be, right? Like we've we've been in several decades, right? Like 90s and the 2000s of the role, or and even longer of, everything the government does is bad, right? And so now, to what extent do we need government to step in and help us to outcompete when your geopolitical rival uses so much of its government resources to enable and support its own industries, right? And so, a lot of the trade stuff has been about complaining about those practices and trying to stop those practices. IRA, in part, is an embrace of those practices of our own, right?
If you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing.
Exactly. So that competition, and we're also seeing that competition play out in the kind of foreign affairs context. China is certainly constructing part of its Belt and Road Initiative outbound investment policies in green framings. So that involves energy investments and rare earths mining, rare minerals mining. And the U.S. framing right now is an exact mirror opposite of China's Belt and Road framing, which is green, health, and digital. But the U.S. framing has added a democratic governance component as a fourth component. And so there's clearly a competition there to see who can do that better. And again, I think that'll be a really interesting area to just see how it plays out. And it's going to play out differently in every single country, depending on the dynamics within a given country.
Yeah, and it might ultimately, one very optimistic read of this would be that the competition between the U.S. and China will be really good for the global South, as these kind of big economic players kind of compete for influence and so on, and that puts them in a better position to negotiate.
Right, exactly. There people who research this are talking about the hedging strategies of the global South, and so obviously it doesn't necessarily play to their advantage. It could just be two hegemons kind of fighting proxy battles and wrecking the battlefield in which they're playing. But again, it's interesting to think about how it could play. Shift from a period where let's say Americans, I think, arguably we're neglecting a lot of these countries, and now they're paying more attention because China's trying to get in there, and so we'll see how that plays out. Yeah.
Well, very interesting stuff. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today. It's been a super, super interesting conversation, and thanks for all the work you do to stay abreast and analyze these incredibly complex and important issues.
Absolutely. And thanks for your podcast. It's such a broad-ranging set of topics. It's not just, I thought it was going to be more of a squarely environmental, but you range across so many topics. It shows your breadth and depth as well.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun. And listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, let us know. You can give us a like, a rating, subscribe to the podcast, and follow us on social media. It'd be great to hear from you. Till next time.